So welcome everyone to the second podcast for the Moving Up Symud I Fyny podcast, which is focused on exploring some of the conversations around our research project here, led from Bangor University, working with Gwynedd County Council, Conwy County Borough Council, Torfaen Council and Anglesey Council, to look at what we can learn from the experiences of young people around working to improve the barriers and the enablers to engagement with care leavers on a multi-agency basis. I'm Ceryl Davies, I'm a researcher lecturer at Bangor University, and I'll be part of this conversation today with some of the other members of the project who I'll pass on now for them all to introduce themselves to you. So I'll just start with you, Louise.
Hi, I'm Louise. I'm a researcher at Bangor University and I'm working with Ceryl on this project.
Hi, I'm Kate. I'm the manager of Torfaen Young People Support Service.
I'm Lisa Jones and I'm the interim service manager for the Vulnerable People team in Conwy, and that covers our personal advisors for care leavers.
Brill, thanks Lisa. And Dafydd?
I'm a social worker and I also supervise the personal advisors in Conwy, and I also review the care leavers pathway plans as well.
Thanks everyone. Good to have everyone as part of this conversation today. And the focus of this conversation will be on discussing, firstly, the enablers that the young people, during the interviews that we facilitated with the young people, what were the enablers that they identified? So we'll be looking at some of the voices of the young people, some of the quotes from the young people, and getting then the reflections from Louise, Kate, Lisa and Dafydd on some of those voices and experiences. We'll be then moving on as part of the conversation to discuss some of the barriers that young people have faced when engaging with services. And then finally, we'll be closing the podcast today with a discussion around the outcomes that young people want to have when they're working and engaging with services. So the first point I'd quite keen to explore with you is around those worker attributes. And what the young people have shared during the interviews, the research interviews, is that firstly, one young person really said that the honesty of the worker is quite a key point. And this young person, who was young person 9, so all of these quotes have been anonymised so that we're protecting the identity of all these young people who have participated as part of our research. And the young person 9 was reflecting, I get along with my personal advisor a lot more because she's never said anything like or promised anything that she can't keep. She's always been honest. So that honesty was coming through for young person 9. I was just wondering, what are your reflections on that kind of view from young person 9?
Well, I think, Ceryl, if we were looking at relationships more generically and not just with young people, it's something that we all want and expect, isn't it, in a relationship? So I think for our staff, it's really important that from the very beginning of that relationship with a young person, they are transparent, there's professional integrity there, and they're really honest. It means that the young person knows what they can expect. And it saves, we know that young people who are care experienced have been let down previously. And I think for me, if we've got staff who aren't as honest as we would like or make promises that they can't keep, it reinforces to the young person any little self-worth that they have for themselves. So for me, I think honesty is something that's really basic, a basic requirement from our staff, but massively important to the young person.
And as you were reflecting there, Lisa, important for most people within everyday relationships, that honesty, and also that kind of promise that you mentioned around if you're saying that you're going to do something, that you're achieving that aim and kind of keeping to that promise in a way.
So for me, they are young people who've had potentially in the past promises broken by trusted adults, people letting them down, people being inconsistent, people dipping in and dipping out according to external pressures. And as a team manager of a team of social workers and YPAs, one of the key things we expect from our staff and what the young people expect from their support staff is that consistency and that reliability, and that they don't expect staff to be available 24/7. They know how the system works. They've grown up within the social care system. What they want is, if the YPA says, I'll see you next week, they want the YPA to turn up next week. They don't necessarily want to be ringing them at midnight. They don't expect them to work Saturdays, but they do want them to say, to stick to what they've agreed to. They want them to be a reliable, trustworthy adult. I think that goes back to what you were saying, doesn't it, Lisa, in terms of when we are looking at YPAs to strengthen young people's support networks, we don't necessarily pursue friendships that don't meet our needs, do we? So in terms of that professional relationship with young people, what they expect from the YPA is, I want you to be reliable, flexible, on time. I want you to do what you say you're going to do, and I want you to be realistic and honest and open with me. And I think that's what the YPAs are strong at. And I think that's what we kind of need to encourage in terms of their development, and for the young people to come back and say what doesn't work. So why is it that YPA isn't working right for you? It's because they do or don't do X, Y, Z for me.
We expect young people to be open and honest with us. You know, if we ask an awful lot of a young person, especially in that beginning stage when we first meet them. So if we're not going to be able to be honest, or if we're making promises that we don't keep, how can we then expect anything different from that young person?
So that kind of trusted relationship, and building that relationship based on really that persistent and that reliable relationship.
And equality, Ceryl. They are equal to us when we start that piece of work. So I think we have to reinforce that at the very beginning.
So kind of having a look also at some of those power dynamics potentially.
Yeah.
One of the young women who was interviewed also kind of commented that she felt very much heard when she was accessing support from her PA. She felt her PA was genuine, and I'm going to feel heard at the end of it. So kind of that feeling of having a voice and feeling heard. Can I come to you, Dafydd, around those kind of reflections on that comment?
When I was a PA before becoming a social worker, when I met the young person for the first time, I used to outline, what supports I could offer, and then it just set the basis for our relationship then. And I think differently to the support that the social work offer, the clues in the title with a personal advisor, we're there to advise them. We're not there to tell them what to do, what they can do, what they can't do. So I think that starts from right from the beginning. You can have more of an adult relationship with them, which they really appreciate as well.
Yeah, that's very important. And kind of Louise, that focus on that advisor role and that adult relationship, is that something that you heard during the interviews with young people?
Yeah, definitely. As David said just now, a lot of young people did speak about it being different, the relationship with the personal advisor, than it was with their social worker. And they really appreciated it because, as Lisa was saying, it's being treated as an adult and having that sort of more equal relationship, so they could voice any concerns. But it was communication that was really important, and honesty, as you said, as one person said, always, keep your promises, good communication skills. Just make sure that person is feeling heard.
Definitely. And that kind of equality is a key aspect that you've mentioned, but also that Lisa's mentioned. And another young person, she made some reflections, and this is her quote. She was really patient with me. And this was the PA, the personal advisor. She was just gentle with me. And I think that's so important. So that listening, communication, kindness, but also being gentle. Any reflections on that experience and that kind of response from one of the young people?
I think a great strength that the PAs have is they can always be there for them. They can give the time for them. They can guide them. I feel a lot of the times, I know everyone's busy, but especially with PAs, you can give more time towards them to build that relationship, and then the trust then just builds between, and the bond grows between them as well.
So that bond, again, that relationship that Lisa mentioned, that everyday relationship that we all value, building that bond, building that trust and patience and kindness and being gentle.
I think, well, I'm in the fortunate position where we've got a stable workforce in terms of a stable team, so that it would be normal in our team for the young person to have the same young person's advisor from the age of 16 to 21, possibly 25 in some circumstances. That makes a difference, doesn't it, when you're asking young people to invest in a long-term relationship rather than, I'll invest in this relationship and then 6 months down the line I might have a different worker, and then 6 months after that I might have a different worker again. And although that happens within the system for various reasons, like you've alluded to, if you're asking young people to invest in us, we need to invest in them, don't we, in terms of that continuing relationship and that being that continuous source of support over a long period of time, and seeing young people through challenges and being there when things are going really well and celebrating that, but also being there when things are really difficult and things perhaps aren't going according to plan or aren't going well. And I think the YPAs are particularly skilled at doing that and having that post-18 role with the young people that is perhaps a little bit different because it's got a different statutory function. There's more care and less control, you could argue, in terms of we're not doing to young people, we're doing with very much post-18, aren't we, in terms of we're acknowledging they are an adult and that they've got certain rights and entitlements as an adult, isn't it? And we're there to walk alongside them rather than do things for them, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And you've mentioned an interesting point there around that balance between that care and control and doing with rather than doing to. Do you think in practice that there are any kind of challenges in achieving that balance?
Yes, because young people and young adults, by their very nature, in exactly the same way as when I was a young adult, I certainly didn't make the correct choices every day of my life, and I don't expect young people who we support to make the correct decisions every day. And that can be a conflict, because just because someone's turned 18 doesn't mean they're any less risky or any less vulnerable than the day before when they were 17. So I think there are challenges, aren't there, as a corporate parent to young people under the age of 21, in terms of balancing that. Of course you can do what you want, but only if I agree that it's the right thing to do. There's that conflict, isn't there? Because the YPAs care about the young people and what happens to them.
And just a note to the listeners here, when we were talking about some decisions that we've made when we were teenagers that weren't always good decisions, everyone on the podcast was nodding. So we've all been in that boat where we've, not just you, Kate, we've all made decisions where we're thinking, reflecting back. But sometimes, and this is just my reflection, sometimes I feel that young people who are care experienced or care leavers are judged more harshly for some of those decisions. I don't know if you would agree with that comment.
Absolutely. And I think an area for me where that's been really evident has been around pre-birth assessments. So when we've had young ladies who fall pregnant and they've automatically been referred for a pre-birth, that's something that Conwy have really challenged and felt was discriminatory, because we wouldn't do it for all young females. So that's just one part, but I think there's lots of evidence out there around that.
Yeah, definitely.
And just going back to a point that Kate had made about, if people aren't, because they've just turned 18, it doesn't mean that they're less risky, etc., because they're now an adult. I would actually go as far as to say some of our young people become more at risk and more vulnerable when they turn 18 because their support network falls away and they have an awful lot of less support, which then again reinforces to them that relationships aren't forever. And I think the way in which we transition or support somebody to transition is so important if we're not going to reinforce some of those negative feelings they already have.
And I think you've picked up on a really important point there, which is one of the barriers to engagement that's been discussed during the interviews. And one of the young people made a comment around that transition and those turning points around, I've lived on my own since I was 16. I've had my own place, so I felt self-reliant, but at the same time, I needed her there. So that challenge of feeling as if you still need the support, but then being told that you're an adult and that you're transitioning to adult services, around that kind of comment on that key turning point, is that something that you're seeing as a challenge for some of the young people that you support?
Definitely. I think, like Lisa was alluding to before, a lot of the care experienced young people when before they turn 18, there's so much support. They've been told what to do, where they have to live, and then when they turn 18, they're expected to sign up for benefits or support with finding work. A lot of the times they have to move from previous foster carers and move to supported accommodation, which a lot of them are not ideal. So there's just massive life impacting decisions that they have to make at 18. A lot of people are quite who have no experience being in care don't have to make these decisions till a lot later. So it's massive, isn't it? And when I think back when I was 18 going to university, I didn't have to think about having to look for my own place or having to manage my money properly, or not having that thought that possibly my parents could help me out if I do run out of money.
Yeah, definitely. And that kind of reflection on that added responsibility, and kind of linking in with that added responsibility, is that something that the young people shared with you during the interviews, Louise?
Yeah, just coming back to what Davies was saying, compared to other young people who aren't care experienced. So Stein refers to this as young people who are care leavers, their experiences are accelerated and compressed at the same time. So it's like you're saying, having to, coming out of care and having, people looking out for you, then having to access benefits or access employment, access housing. And this can be difficult, but what they were saying is that, the PAs are helping them in a practical role, helping them with practical support. So some young people were saying, I don't like it. I don't like it that I've just come out of having, wraparound support to now having to do things by myself with the assistance of a PA. But others said, I like now that I don't have this wraparound, so people looking out for me all the time and asking me to repeat my story. I like now that I'm being treated as an adult and I can go forward.
So that kind of key turning points towards adulthood, which gives some of those opportunities potentially, but also some of those challenges, which can be very different to some of the young people that you're supporting within your services. One of the other themes that the young people discussed around the enablers was that building of that relationship, which we've been discussing already today. And one of the key kind of reflections from one of the young people, young person 8, made some comments around, she really tried to get to know me first before asking me anything too personal. And that was a really good trait. So again, building that relationship and the personal advisor giving that young person the space to be able to kind of get to know her, build that trusting relationship before having to maybe discuss some of the personal kind of information. Any reflections around young person's comments there?
I think for me, Ceryl, it goes back to the point that I made earlier about relationships in general. In another world, we wouldn't start a relationship with somebody by telling them, our most sensitive information, would we? We wouldn't go to a stranger and say, this is me. But I suppose as staff, we often expect somebody to do that quite early on in the relationship. So I think for me, we absolutely should start with the simple, well, I say simple things, they're really massive, but things with, what do you like? What makes you you? And we leave some of that really heavy stuff until further down the line when somebody is actually ready to speak about it, and not because we as staff feel we need to tick boxes. So I think for me, that's really important.
I think that's kind of reflecting on our conversation today, that kind of building on that relationship seems to be that foundation. And also understanding the experiences of young people who are care leavers within that context, but also within the context of other kind of everyday normative relationships. And as you mentioned there, Lisa, that you take time to build that relationship, that trusting relationship, to share some of your personal information. And kind of looking at the flip side now and some of the barriers to engagement. One of the young people made it very clear that what they struggled with was that young person 3 commented, I feel that I'm constantly reopening wounds. Every time I'm being assessed by services, that's repeating the cycle and the information again. And then also another young person 4, made a comment around the barriers to engagement, feeling that they were having a meeting within a public space, and then the paperwork on the laptop would come out within that public space when they were sitting down and having conversation and a cup of tea, and then the laptop and the files would come out, and they felt this is where the conversation's not every day. So I don't know, what are your reflections on both of those kind of views and experiences?
I think for me, Ceryl, the meeting with young people in a public place, I think that really made me reflect on some of our practices, because actually I think if we're going to be really honest, we thought asking a young person to come for a coffee with us and go to a public space was actually in the young person's best interest, because it was away from everybody else. It seemed quite normal. But actually hearing what the young people have said, that's something that I've definitely reflected on, because we did see it as good practice.
But I think it depends on what conversations you're having, doesn't it? So we've
Yeah.
got staff who regularly, so I've just been in a meeting now where the young person is reviewing the hot chocolate and the standard of hot chocolate across a certain area with their worker, and that's a social worker. But, they sit down, they rate the hot chocolate out of 10, and they have conversations about hot chocolate. They may then in the car on the way there or on the way back have conversations about other things, but whilst they're in the cafe, they're talking about the decor, they're talking about, and it's because that particular young person has got massive confidence issues in terms of being out in public. So I think when you're out in a cafe or a public space, isn't it? As long as you're not talking about that young person's family, or you're bringing a laptop out, or you're bringing case notes out, I don't think that's an issue, is it? It's a bit about, would I go out with a friend or a family member or someone that I get support from and have a conversation in a public space about the innermost workings of my mind? No, I probably wouldn't. I probably want to be somewhere private for that. And I think it's about that, isn't it, Lisa? It's about judging when, where and how we have those conversations with young people, with due regard to their right to privacy, with their right to have a normal conversation with another human being about either big stuff that really affects them or tiny stuff that may be completely inconsequential to the whole relationship, isn't it? But actually is about relationship building and is about just having a normal human interaction, if that makes sense.
And checking with the young person, because I think we've kind of assumed that taking them for the coffee is normalising things, but actually what we should be doing with every single contact is checking with that young person. How do they want that contact to go? Where do they want it, and who do they want there? And I think we should be doing that with every contact at the very beginning, and not making the assumption that actually this is what somebody might want.
Yeah. And that goes to that kind of relationship building, that relationship-based social work, but also looking at that tailored support to that young person and looking at the context of the conversation as well. But what I love from both of your comments there, Lisa and Kate, is those rich reflections and that kind of approach to checking in with yourself around, how do you feel about that? Is this practice okay? How can we develop it? And I think that is a credit to your practice development. But also, Kate, in future podcasts, I would love to hear where has the best hot chocolate, okay? So, that sounds brilliant, going around and rating hot chocolates, what's not to like. So kind of moving on to some of the outcomes that the young people wanted. They wanted kind of that sense of more power and control over their own voice and decision making, but in a supported way, to kind of increase their confidence, but also reduce that kind of isolation. So one of the young people commented, and this is a comment from young person 9, said basically, I definitely feeling more in control. There's no one to ask for housing, about where to live and stuff like that. And my social worker, my personal advisor, then stepped in and spoke for me. So that advocacy, that relationship, that support. And then young person 12 was commenting, I'm feeling more confident about things, just knowing that the support is there and that they're there for me. I think it helps a lot. So those reflections from the young people, that having that safety net of support, that they can dip in and out as they wish, gives them that control, that support and that confidence. So just kind of reflecting on those comments, how does that kind of land with you guys?
Yeah, especially when a young person turns 18, I think it's really important that a PA is there quite intense, does some intense work with a young person, because obviously 18, 19, 20 at the time that care experienced young people really do need the support. support to attend meetings, their first job centre appointments, because even walking into a council building like ours, it's really daunting. So just having that extra support just to walk in with them and just advocate on their behalf, I think that's probably the most important role a PA could do, is advocate, support them, because like Lisa was alluding to before, they do face a lot of discrimination, unfortunately. We see it all the time with housing, that title of care experiencing people, and landlords just turn them away straight away. But I'm quite fortunate. I see different care experiencing people from the ages to 18 up to 25, and you can see that obviously when they're younger they do need that support, but when they reach the ages of 24, 25, they're self-sufficient and the contact is minimal, which is really nice. Their independence has grown, their confidence has grown, and it just shows that the process does work most of the time.
And I also think the strength of the YPA, in terms of a good YPA in the advocacy role, isn't necessarily just agreeing with everything the young person says or wants. The role of a good parent or a good corporate parent or a good YPA, it's an extension of the corporate parent, is to listen to what the young people are saying, reflect back, have conversations about that, and then advocate, rather than, oh, you want that, so that's what we're going to do. It's about that conversation, isn't it, between the YPA and the young person? Because to be a good YPA, I think you've got to be able to challenge young people, haven't you, and say no and agree to things, but not necessarily just say advocacy is about giving you everything you want or agreeing to everything you're saying, because I don't necessarily think that is either. It's not real life either, is it? It's not necessarily showing the young person that they can always say, I want this, and we can always deliver. As a reasonable YPA and being an advocate, it's about enabling young people ultimately to be able to do without us, in the same way as a young person would leave home. And leaving care should mirror leaving home, shouldn't it, in my view, in terms of upskilling young people to advocate for themselves. That's the skill of a really good YPA, in my view.
Yeah, I was going to say similar. Being a good advocate for a young person is around supporting young people to be able to problem solve and rationalise. Because we work with some young people who they do everything quite quickly, and they're quite reactive, and it's about giving them a safe space to talk about that. Why are they reacting in this way? Was that the best way? But giving them the skills, the confidence and the abilities, like I said, to problem solve themselves and rationalise why something isn't quite right, or we have to do something in a different way. So again, it's not doing for, it's doing with.
And around that kind of key concept around doing with rather than doing for, is that something that you kind of heard within the interviews, Louise?
Yeah, definitely. A lot of young people refer to having a professional friend. So somebody who, they would be alongside them. They could fall back on them. They knew they could fall back on them if needed, which sort of made them feel more confident. And that would snowball. So once they had this confidence, that would build up, and then they would make contact with other services and find some more things out. And the feeling from that would quite often there'd be a weight off their shoulders. People refer to having a weight off their shoulders, a weight off their chest, in having more confidence and less anxiety.
And just kind of going to a really quite a powerful quote from young person 10, who kind of really described everything that we've just been discussing now around that kind of really tailored support. And this young person mentioned, so I will now go to people with more things. I'll ask for more help than that I would have before. I'm happier in the way that I engage with people, because when I'm stressed, I tend to withdraw. Obviously, when I'm engaging, that's eased, so you tend to socialise a bit more. So around that young person saying, now I want to engage more, how does that kind of land with you?
I totally agree. A lot of the time you can get young people calling you and they're shouting, they're screaming, but I think half the time they're not shouting at you, they're venting. A lot of the young people, they've had a lot of trauma in their lives, and they do struggle to regulate what emotions they have, and it usually does come out as shouting. But as the points before we were talking about, it's a vital role for the PA just to be there, just to listen, just to be that calming voice and just give some advice. So it's just really important.
And sometimes we do have to do it for them, don't we, David? So sometimes there may be A GP appointment is a classic example. So it may be that a young person is experiencing difficulties, usually 18 plus, with their mental health. They need to go to the GP to discuss that. The YPA would go with them. They would have that conversation with the young person before the appointment about what they need to say. They walk into the doctor's surgery, they sit down, and the young person opens their mouth and nothing comes out. No words come out. So the YPA's role there, isn't it, David, is to say to the young person, remember what we talked about, and to assist them to have that conversation. And that's what a reasonable parent would do, isn't it? They would sit there and enable their child to have the conversation, but very much if they weren't able to, this young person has come here today to talk about, and to not be dismissed. Because I think in the same way as the job centre you said earlier, isn't it, David, earlier, when a young person is either fight or flight and they're stuck in that kind of that kind of yo-yoing kind of experience of, I don't know what to say, I don't know what to do, so I'm either going to panic or say nothing or shout or escalate or leave 9 times out of 10 and say nothing at all, and the problem keeps coming back and keeps representing. What we need to be able to do, isn't it, is to show them how to, by being there alongside them, if that makes sense.
And just being confident, isn't it? Because obviously young people are going to feed off the PA or the social worker's confidence, and to see a lot of the times the young people, they overcomplicate things in their minds and think, I don't know what to say. But if you just do it in an easy, simple manner, then they feed off it, and their confidence build as well.
So that kind of link with building confidence and giving kind of young people the tools to have their own voice, kind of linking in with what we were discussing before around, doing with rather than doing to. And around building that confidence, Louise, I could see you nodding. Is that something that the young people shared with you during the interviews?
Yeah, definitely. I'd say confidence was probably the biggest theme throughout. And what Kate was saying, there were stories there of not being able to go to the GP and having that anxiety, but then having it dealt with and and doing with meant that they've done that now, and they might have the tools. They spoke about having strategies to be able to go on and do it again. But it's interesting, David, what you were saying as well about, obviously the PA needs to be confident, and I hadn't thought of that. I hadn't thought, of course, the person that they need to have that strength. They need to be confident to be able to accommodate them without, so that person feels safe.
And kind of linking in with that comment around confidence, the support for PAs as well within this role, because this role is a very worthwhile role that can be challenging at times and can also be dealing with quite complex and sensitive issues. So within your roles, how would you promote that support for PAs to address some of these really quite challenging and sensitive issues?
I think our PAs support each other pretty well. They're quite a tight unit. There's 5 full-time YPAs in Torfaen, and they look out for each other. They check in on each other. We are back in the office certain days a week, which makes a big difference to us, and not every local authority has that. I think that makes a big difference. In our area as well, the YPAs are all supervised by different people, which is interesting because we've tried different models. So we've had one person being responsible for all of them. We've had other times where staff have been responsible for different pockets of YPAs. What we've come to now is a kind of hybrid arrangement where I have overall kind of responsibility, but then the YPAs are clustered, so they have one side of one ATM supervises 2.5 and the other ATM supervises the other 2.5 effectively, and that works really well for us. It also avoids that almost cross-contamination of a social worker who's allocated to a case or who has previously been allocated to a case then supervising the staff member who's delivering the YPA role, which is something that has obviously come up historically in terms of leaving care support, which is why the YPA role was created, in terms of not having the budget holder and the decision maker also coordinating the support of the staff that are delivering the service, if that makes sense. So I think good YPA support is crucial, and I hadn't thought of it, David, either, about the confidence of the staff member being able to do those things. But you're right, it does make a difference, doesn't it? Because if the young person's sitting there with a trusted adult who doesn't know what they're doing, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be able to do it either, does it? Because they're thinking, well, that's when you speak. That's not for me to speak now. I'm looking to you to do that for me. And you like to think the staff know that, but it's not something that I'd considered necessarily either, bizarrely, David, but it's made me think today.
So, yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? And sometimes when you're having these conversations, it makes you kind of reflect on maybe that dual role and the dual challenges of that role, which is interesting. But also around going back to what we were discussing at the start of the podcast, around that persistent, patient, and that relationship-based support. Because we would all be looking at that throughout our relationships on a personal level. So thank you everyone for such an interesting podcast discussion around the enablers and barriers and the outcomes. I'm just going to come to everyone individually now just to have some final reflections or final food for thought, if that's okay. So I'll come to you first, Louise.
I think the main thing is everything we've covered, the consistency, being responsive, not promising things, but from the interviews, how much the young people really did appreciate when they had a good PA or good social worker, what a difference it made to them.
100%. So the impact of that difference when you've got that really good relationship. Great. Thanks, Louise. If I can come to you, Dafydd.
I think a key message always comes out up in the reviews I do with the PAs and with the young people is the consistency. A lot of them have had the same PAs for a number of years compared to when they were child looked after. They had, a lot of different social workers. They were struggling to build that relationship. So having that consistency of one PA for a longer period of time really makes a difference, and obviously builds confidence, builds trust, and it just helps them to develop and build as a person as well.
So that kind of consistency and quality, again, of that relationship, which is coming out as such a strong theme throughout this podcast. Thanks, Dafydd. And if I can come to you, Kate.
I think that the YPA is as part of the whole system. So the YPA is one person and one trusted adult in that young person's life, and may or may not be the person that young person turns to have difficult conversations. And I think it's that enabling part of the YPA post to enable young people to expand that support network to mirror that of a young person who may have left home or left care in a very different way. I do think it's about being that trusted, consistent adult to give reasonable advice, whether or not the young person agrees with it or takes action from it, but they're able to give it consistently.
So being that kind of critical friend.
Yeah.
That critical friend, both from kind of that advice and guidance, which is every day and which is proportionate and reasonable. It's lovely. Diolch, Kate. Thank you. And if I can come to you, Lisa.
I think for me, it's just remembering that to treat people the way I want to be treated. I think that's really important because often we have demands, etc. And we've spoken about, people going in and asking questions, quite heavy questions at the beginning of a relationship. And so for me, I think if we treat everybody the way we want to be treated, then it's probably half the battle.
Yeah, I agree. So being real world and kind of aligning that experience with our other relationships. Thank you, everyone. Really enjoyed the discussion today and the reflections around the conversations on the enablers, barriers, and also the outcomes for the young people that we've interviewed as part of this research project. So look out in the future for podcast 3, which will be exploring conversations on a different aspect of this All Wales project. Thank you, everyone. Diolch am wrando. Thank you for listening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This research is led by Bangor University in partnership with our fantastic partners from GISTA, Gwynedd County Council, Conwy County Borough Council, Ynys Môn Council and Torfaen Council. And we would like to thank Health and Care Research Wales for funding this All Wales research.